Hello and welcome back to CyberSmart.Live. I'm your host, Julia Bell, and we've already had a morning full of industry-leading insights, expertise, thought leadership. So let's continue on that discussion trail with an interactive panel session where we're going to unpack the changing face of cyber insurance. Where is cyber insurance now? How did we get here? What are the best practices? And where can we expect to be heading in the next 5 years? To dig into that, it's my privilege to welcome up James Tutel, Investment Director at EOS Venture Partners, Harry Dibben, Underwriting Lead for Professions, Cyber and Tech at Superscript, Dr. Konstantinos Mercenas, Associate Professor at Royal Holloway University of London, Joe Hancock, Head of Cyber Investigations at Mission de Raya LLP, and Akash Baradia, Global Cyber and Technology Digital Transformation Lead at Axis Capital. What a lineup, what a group of professions we've got in those titles. Great to have you with us. How are you all doing?
Good. Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Great to have you. Thank you so much. It's also just good to check that we can hear you because now we're in the virtual world. Thank you so much for joining us, folks. And I'll appeal to our audience. If you'd like to get involved in this conversation directly, you're absolutely more than welcome to. Just pop your questions in the chat. We can bring you right up on stage with us. So, folks, we've got about half an hour together and lots of stuff to dig into. So rather than getting into some introductions, let's make the most of our time together and set the scene. And I'm sure you'll share some of your background as we get into these. But just on this scene setting piece, could you share your take on the current state of cyber insurance? What trends you're seeing perhaps just now? Akash, could I come to you first off to share your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing, I think the best way to sum it up is more destructive, more destructive attacks, more downtime, and higher demands. There's sort of the 3Ds of the trends I'm seeing at the moment. What I mean by that is more destructive malware, more destructive tactics. So certainly in some ransom cases, we're seeing people will, as well as locking up the systems, they'll actually exfiltrate data out of the network. And it's sort of like a double trouble, if you will, right? They'll threaten to publish. There's sort of threat of reputational damage. And then on the other side of it, the increasing cost of the sort of business interruption, really, and the downtime, what the real impact is of that dollar wheel not being spinning at those companies, or pound wheel.
That kind of double trouble that you described, that double peril, if you will, is, I'm sure, top of mind for lots of folks on the call. Harry, I suppose we should come to you for your expertise on this as well. What are you seeing? Anything to add to that?
No, I think I'd probably just echo what Akash is seeing. I mean, there was a bit of a drop-off in just generally claims happening over the past sort of year or so with the war in Ukraine happening. But obviously, we're now starting to see a few more of these attacks sort of taking place. So it's an interesting one to watch. I think we'll have to see how it develops over the next 12 months.
Yeah, it's always so fascinating to see how geopolitics kind of impacts this sphere in particular. Akash, just in my introduction there, I talked about how we can kind of potentially learn from other disciplines within this space because especially cybersecurity, is so new compared to the insurance industry as a whole, which is, I suppose, hundreds of years old. What learnings can we take into this space that perhaps we've neglected so far, or perhaps we haven't dived into deep enough?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, cyber insurance really has only been around for about 20 years. And we say that we're having our seatbelt moment now. There was a time that seatbelts weren't mandatory for cars. And as that sort of change came in, you saw a massive decrease in the amount of sort of accidents and impact of those accidents, right? And so we're sort of having that seatbelt moment in cyber at the moment. Another one is obviously just fire. Fire is something we've been dealing with for hundreds of years as a risk and as a resource. But fire alarms, things like the fire brigade, these sort of building code regulations, these are new, not new, but new concepts potentially for cyber to sort of bring across into our world.
Yeah, and to not really allow that lag, that delay to happen, which seems to have happened in other disciplines. So thank you just for giving us that context. Konstantinos, perhaps I could come to you for a bit of a therapy session, if you will, from your position at Royal Holloway London and what expertise you're offering. What would you say the main challenges are, just in general, in the cyber insurance space, that the front line are facing? What are you picking up?
Yes, thank you. So I think we can categorize this into two aspects here. The one is internal and the other external threats, for example. So in the internal one, we've seen that cyber insurance has not been around for too long. So, there are the mathematical models and the availability of data that they have within the industry. So that's a limitation on its own, and how this develops and evolves to provide better, description of how we can cope with threats. But then we also have the external threats themselves. And we see, we have seen during the past years, crime as a service, ransomware as a service, access as a service now. So I think the main challenge is that criminal groups, cyber criminal groups, are evolving in a sense into being very well organized and well functioning businesses. And this is something we have to consider, and this is something we have to appreciate, so that we can study and explore these threats more successfully.
Yeah, and I suppose, the humbling recognition that sophistication is moving at breakneck speed, and so must we. And I think Alexis talked about the fact that your comfort zone will kill you. Once you've started to suss out a problem, then they're on to the next, if not the next one beyond that. Thank you, Konstantinos. Joe, could I come to you? Any more challenges to add to the menu that I suppose might be felt by our attendees and beyond?
Yeah, I think we should perhaps deal with the elephant in the room, which is that a lot of my clients at the moment aren't necessarily confident in the cyber insurance coverage they're getting. And by that, I mean that they're seeing premiums go up, they're seeing lots more questions than ever before, which is the right thing, by the way, when it comes to underwriting. And they're not entirely confident, I think, in the response they get. Sometimes the response they get feels like it's the cheapest available provider, not necessarily the best provider to help them. So we're seeing clients start to think about self-insuring, taking reduced coverage, and it's perhaps what they actually need. And it kind of feels to me like there's a challenge at the moment where the cyber security profession needs to really better articulate the value of insurance. And also, I think there's a responsibility on the insurance industry to make sure it's meeting those kind of client demands that feel like they're kind of changing a little.
Yeah. Why do you think that resistance, Joe, is currently there? You talk about needing to communicate the value. Really, in that context, the implication is that value isn't intrinsically understood. Where's that gap come from, do you think?
I think it's often the common problem of insurance when you really need it, when you don't have it. And sometimes, unless you've actually been able to have a successful claim, you've had an incident, you've seen the benefits it brings, in a world of increasing premiums and a hardening market, that value starts to be a bit more intangible. It's one of those things you can't kind of reach out and touch. And this is the problem we've had in cybersecurity for decades. Security is one of those things that if you have it, you don't have any problems. And so therefore people then question, well, why did we have it in the first place?
Yeah, it's that chicken and the egg thing, isn't it? And endlessly frustrating in this space, the hindsight and the nightmare of that. Akash, I know that, we've been talking about the sophistication of bad actors and what that might bring in terms of challenges to the front line and how that might change. What are you noticing? What might, our attendees be fearing in this space from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it's the sort of lack of hesitation to destroy, which is the best way I can put it. There used to be this sort of honor amongst thieves model, right, where you've got some of these threat actors will actually have whole support teams of people you can phone in if you've had an issue decrypting, and they will actually help you out. They might even send somebody on site to help you recover your information following any negotiations. And so, that doesn't seem to be as prevailing anymore. I think there's a bit more destruction, more destructive tactics, and then also this sort of threat, again, like I was saying, that reputational damage that might come from having your data published online, being named and shamed by some of these firms. That seeming to me as a new thing. We're only seeing that in the last year or two, really.
And like you say, reputational damage that comes from that sense of shame that is quite embedded in this space, that you don't want to be seen to have been the one that's been victimized of this. So best to do everything you can to prevent it, but then of course accepting it if it happens and taking action moving forward. Thank you for that. James, perhaps I could come to you then on this. We've talked about challenges that are being faced on the front line. What then does that present insurers in terms of challenges when it comes to you looking into this, underwriting this, and dealing with it?
Yeah, and I think for all of the good reasons that the other panelists have mentioned, it creates challenges for insurers. Insurers have historically liked to underwrite and price risk based on significant historical data, and there just isn't that there available in the cyber market. That coupled with the fact that the bad actors' methodologies and the sophistication of the attacks is evolving at a rapid pace, it makes it difficult to underwrite and price the risk. There is also the issue that there isn't a standard benchmark for cybersecurity hygiene at the insureds. So there could be, some insureds that have, CISOs and sophisticated, technology teams, and there are others where, the front door keys are left in the front door. And at the moment, it's very hard for the insurers to really get a handle on the cyber hygiene of the insureds that they're insuring. Yeah. And all of this really leads to the fact that there is a bit of a capacity constraint in the broader insurance market because it's a new emerging risk. It's rapidly evolving. There is actually a bit of a capacity constraint for a lot of these insurers to be able to write the business. There is arguably more demand than supply at the moment in the cyber market. And you're seeing that sort of acutely felt by the new emerging digital cyber insurers, where they're reliant on the sort of larger insurance market to bring capacity in to be able to underwrite the risk. So there's a bit of a crunch on the back end for insurers as well.
Yeah, and like you say, without that historical data, you're having to sort of build the train as it moves along the tracks and learn as we go here. But folks, we've kind of just built together a menu of challenges, and I suppose that could be seen as a bit depressing, but we'll dig into some best practices in a moment as to how we can overcome these in the time that we've got. But first off, I'd just love to kind of get a sense of what dynamics, and we won't just keep it negative, we'll also ask for any positive dynamics that you might expect to shape the cyber insurance industry in the next 5 years. For example, in our opening presentation, Alexis Conran talked about the opportunities and challenges presented by, for instance, Chat GPT and AI and things like that in that space. Akash, could I come to you? What sort of positive or negative impacts could you see that sort of technology having on this arena?
Yeah, I think when any of these technologies come to or reach us or reach our industry, it's quite exciting, especially from going from reading about it and seeing things online and the opportunities. But yeah, I think the dangers. One thing that comes to mind specifically, one of my friends works for he's a malware researcher, and he actually managed to get GPT to write him an attack without having to write any code. He just, with prompts, managed to write a whole exploit, which is pretty dangerous. And I think if we see those sort of tactics being used at scale, that could be really bad news for us. But on the flip side, then the opportunities to leverage that sort of technology on our side would be around actually handling the intake, right? So if we suddenly got thousands of calls from every single one of our customers facing this massive issue, we could actually sort of scale out the communications and the response by having AI-enabled conversations with them.
Yeah, I suppose it swings and roundabouts in what you make it do for you. The power is in the briefer as to whether it's for good or ill in that sense. Great to get that perspective from you. And then James, I suppose I made you pile on to me some of the challenges that insurers might face in the future, but could you perhaps share if there's anything kind of positive you can see round the corner that might give us an advantage that we don't perhaps have now or we haven't had in the past?
Yeah, I think the insurance products that are on offer today, the insurance offerings will evolve for the better. You'll see that there are more and more products that are fit and for purpose and are tailored to specific organizations based on their cybersecurity, protocols, based on their footprint, based on their size, particularly for SMEs. I think that there will be hopefully an increasing focus and more bespoke and better offerings for SMEs. I think the other thing is that the insurers are getting a bit more up to speed on the claim side of the insurance offering. So there's actually a significant amount of insurance claims is actually not because of ransomware, it's more due to business interruption. And so there are steps that can be taken earlier in that claims journey to support with restoration, business interruption, getting businesses back on their feet. And I think that ultimately will lead to a better service, a better offering to the insureds. And then you may also see more innovative insurance products. So there may be some carve-outs for things like cloud outages. So you may actually buy a separate insurance product for cloud outages, which would be separate to the sort of broader cyber offering. So again, there may be a bit more of a menu of products that the insureds can choose from that sort of fits their needs, and ultimately more coverage at a better, more favourable price.
Yeah, and I think some of the conversation here so far today has been about perhaps small and medium enterprises thinking, how is this relevant to me? In what way would this specifically affect me? But if you're talking about a bespoke approach whereby their business feels directly covered for the various areas that it has, then that, I suppose, is much brighter for the future. Just talking then, folks, about best practices. We've talked about what we're facing. How can we best deal with it? I suppose, like in any other insurance discipline, it's best to move towards a model that makes good practices a condition for gaining that insurance, a prerequisite, if you will. So cybersecurity practices, cybersecurity hygiene will have to come in to play here. If you've got a good record, then that's going to put you in good stead. What would those sort of standardized practices look like? What would that checklist look like? Harry, could I come to you first on that one?
Yeah, of course you can. So just a bit of a preamble, really. I mean, insurance is sort of increasingly being viewed as a force of positive change. I mean, if we look at Lloyd's at the minute, they've got plans to effectively phase out thermal coal business by 2025. And if you look at some of the sectors like the D&O market, ESG concerns are coming at the forefront of all underwriting aspects, with reinsurers becoming sort of less willing to get involved with some of the more environmentally damaging areas of the global economy. So, I mean, as the availability of insurance for these sectors declines, the hope is that in turn, these activities are sort of wound down and taper off. So in a similar way, insurance can be used as the catalyst to drive sort of greater cybersecurity practices across the wider economy by enforcing higher standards as a prerequisite to cover. I mean, generally, cyber readiness is fairly poor across the board, especially amongst SMEs. And sort of partly the insurer's fault, but in a drive to proliferate the cover, some underwriting standards have been fairly lax, which has led to sort of a lot of underprepared businesses purchasing cyber, which kind of mixes up the pot a little bit and makes it all the problems that we talked about earlier are kind of exacerbated when there's a wide-ranging risk pool in there.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're talking really about making advancements before answering those fundamental and foundational questions. So that knowledge is needed before you set about on that journey. Akash, when it comes to even paying a ransom, perhaps there's kind of a lack of sureness about what the best practices are there and whether you're meant to let the government know or whatever. What kind of questions might leaders be asking in that particular space?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's I know the Department of Financial Services in New York, for example, and again with GDPR, and some of these bureaus have been set up now where before you pay a ransom, you actually need to contact that agency and let them know who you're going to be paying it to, and they're going to go and check that they're not sanctioned, you're not financing any sort of further acts or anything like that, which is pretty new. And then the other thing is obviously is, again, regulation for boards of companies, so they seem to be a bit more aware of the issues that are going on at this level, and their responsibilities as well in terms of the company's response to those. If we go from it's not if, it's when, and it's about being resilient, and it's about knowing that when that impact happens, you've got the right frameworks, the right policies, the right communications networks to be able to weather that.
Is something that cyber ratings, is that something that we ought to see coming in? Is it something we can expect to see coming in, Akash? You're nodding. So
yeah, definitely. The ratings has been it's been quite a hot space for the last few years in our sector, just as data is becoming more available and the value of a application form or driving using the rear view mirror, as I say, is starting to be diminished, right, in terms of some of this real information, real-time info you can have going on throughout the life of the policy as well. Yeah, but again, you need to be willing to share that information with your insurer, which might be a little bit scarier than maybe filling in a questionnaire once a year.
It's just going to take some unlearning and unpicking of old practices in order to handle this new landscape, and like you say, new channels of communication with the government, new channels of communication with your insurer, and so on. Thank you. Joe, what, I know this is your area, what could a multidisciplinary approach do to help us here? In what way would that impact this, and what would that look like?
I think in several ways. I mean, we're not going to solve cybersecurity or cyber insurance challenges just within the cybersecurity community, or even more specifically within the technology community. Involving a wider range of stakeholders within an organization is definitely helpful. I mean, ultimately, an insurance buying decision to a certain degree is a financial decision. Having your more financially aware stakeholders on board and communicating with them in a way that they understand, a more numerate way, is really useful. But again, there was the comment earlier about a move towards kind of assessing ESG issues. Seeing cybersecurity through an ESG lens as a societal responsibility, I think, is also very important for driving change. So these different perspectives, and ultimately, therefore, different disciplines and different stakeholders, I think, will help us take some views on this, and therefore might provide some opportunities.
Yeah. And Joe, can I ask, is the multidisciplinary approach happening now, or are we quite away from that? I know that it's a very broad question, but then broadly speaking, what's your perspective? Where are we on where we need to be?
I hate to say this, but it's very much an it depends answer. Yeah. Some organizations we deal with, I see a very broad approach to risk issues more generally involving people across the organization. However, in some organizations, we still see cybersecurity really meaning kind of IT security and being dealt with just as a technical kind of function, ignoring some of those wider issues. And you mentioned paying ransoms. A ransomware issue straight away involves more people, I'd argue, outside of the cybersecurity space than it does involving those in it, from negotiating to making the payment, to checking whether someone's a sanctioned entity, looking at all the reputational and business risks around it. But again, we treat it as a tech problem quite often. And so I think we're definitely on the journey. We're further along the journey than we were even 3 years ago, where things were still very much IT security focused, but we have a way to go.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, it would be one for many, but not all. It would be a case of when the ransomware issue hits, that's when suddenly everyone realizes how integral their role is to it. But until then, the planning or prevention comes to a bit of a silo within the organization in many cases, I'm sure. Konstantinos, just on this multidiscipline approach, this alignment between different teams, different groups, different parts of the organization, what other challenges might there be, particularly when it comes to different regions or different countries, if you're looking at a huge multinational organization, for example?
Yes, thank you. That's a very good point. And in fact, I would like to draw an analogy here with academia, because this is what we're advocating during the past several years. An interdisciplinary approach is the only way to solve cybersecurity issues and tackle them. And so, for example, we see now, we have collaborations with psychology, economics, international relations, and so on, legal, law, and so on and so forth within cybersecurity, because cybersecurity itself is not a discipline on its own. It combines so many things. So I'd like to, you mentioned the ransomware payment, right? And we see increasing pressure to ban this in certain states and countries. So that would create some sort of complexity in the game, if I can call it a game here, because I think we can model it like that. So we will see, and we already see threat actors targeting specific countries and regions based on the specific circumstances there, which are usually regulations. Okay, so I think it's not just jurisdiction, it can be even within the same company, but it's also a collaboration problem here. And we will see also the behavior of threat actors changing according to what we do. But it's not to be expected that each country will consider the broader picture when they take their own decisions, okay? And I think mostly it comes from separating between public and private sector. So we have the issue of considering an attack being against national security, right? And this is an issue for insurance as well. I don't know, the colleagues here can talk about this more maybe, but how we characterize the attack and what sort of incentives each of the parties have is different.
Yeah.
So we might say, let's not pay ransom for national infrastructure or public sector, if they're hit. But what about a business who have their own interests and they want to survive and, maintain their operations?
Yeah.
So
And
the complexity increases.
big time, and so does therefore the need for communication, alignment, and constant reevaluation and understanding of not just what's happening here, but what's happening everywhere. But Konstantinos, in complete, I suppose, in the complete opposite direction, James, I'd love to come to you, because lots of the attendees who are joining us today are perhaps from the smaller or more medium-sized operations. What might the impact of these challenges be on them particularly?
Well, I think if we look at sort of cybersecurity processes and regulation, and everyone's sort of talking about the bar, becoming a bit higher and a bit more standardized, I think it's particularly important, these processes and regulation, particularly important in building trust and reducing risk in supply chains and in vendor management. So I personally think it's likely to become table stakes over time for companies to do business with each other, that there is a certain level of cyber hygiene, cybersecurity processes in place. And from an SME perspective, I think that's going to be particularly important for them to be able to demonstrate, when engaging and when working with larger organization or enterprises that are just used to having that sort of higher security, processes and procedures. So I think, SMEs, from that perspective, really just trying to reduce that risk in the supply chain is going to be pretty important, I think.
Yeah, no, really great. Just to get, I suppose it's quite a dichotomy of perspectives, heavy overlap, but great to get that clarity between the two. Thank you, panelists. We've just got about 5 minutes left. And in that time, I wanted to, while I have you all, launch a poll with our attendees and sense check where they sit on this. And then perhaps we could unpack it together, if that's okay with you. So with these ideas, folks, fresh on our minds, let's launch that second interactive poll and check in on where you sit. You should see it appearing on your screens now. And it asks this: what level of involvement do you have with your customers when it comes to cyber insurance? Here are your options, and please do just pick one for this one as well if you could. So is it that you're actively referring customers to a preferred broker or insurer? Are you supporting with completing insurance questionnaires? Perhaps you have no current involvement, but you are keen to explore further. Maybe you're going to say that you don't get asked about cyber insurance, or perhaps you might say that you choose not to get involved with cyber insurance. Really helpful for us to just see where you sit on this, and we can unpack it together. That question once more: what level of involvement do you have with your customers when it comes to cyber insurance? Get your answers in so that we can get a sense of where you sit on this. So I'll count you down to that poll closing so you can get those last answers in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Okay, that poll is now closed. Thank you so much for taking part in that. It's going to be really interesting just for us to get a sense of where you are. And panelists, while our production team are compiling those results into something readable, I'd love to just get a sense of some practical takeaways, i.e., what can we, both as industry leaders, business owners, what can we do to better assess organizational risk in this landscape, changing though it is? Konstantinos, could I come to you? What takeaway would you like to share?
Yes, absolutely. If I have to mention one thing here, I would go for better risk assessment via risk quantification. This is not terribly new, but things that are created take a lot of time to become a norm in the industry. So that's something that would, in my opinion, that would greatly assist in assessing risk more broadly.
Really great. Thank you for sharing that. My producer Carl is telling me that those poll results are ready. So on that note, production team, could we get those up so that with my panel we can see where everyone sat? Panel, I'll read these out for you. We asked, of course, what level of involvement you have with your customers when it comes to this particular topic, cyber insurance. 50%, i.e. the biggest chunk of you, said that you're offering support with completing insurance questionnaires. That's where you sit on this. And then some of you are saying, 24% in fact, no current involvement, but keen to explore further. And then under that, we don't get asked about cyber insurance, 16% of you. So those were the top marks. Most of you saying support with completing insurance questionnaires. But actually on this point, no current involvement, but keen to explore further. Akash, 24% of our attendees said that they're keen to look into this more than they currently are. What would your advice be then to take those initial steps?
Well, firstly, please email me if you want to talk about it at all. Secondly, I'd say, there's so much information online about this. There's so many resources, things like CyberSmart's program as well, right? There's accreditations, things like Cyber Essentials Plus. They take a lot of the guesswork out of what you need to be investing in and what you need to be focusing on, and they just get you up to that minimum standard. And then even further in some cases, right, you can have Cyber Essentials Plus. And so I think really just sort of focusing on the resources that have been given to us. But again, it's nice to have an expert to talk to in that industry. So if anybody did want to have some of those unique perspectives, we see so many incidents compared to what you're seeing in the news as an insurance company. So our perspectives can be quite useful for some of these customers making those decisions. And we're very happy to offer our perspectives.
Yeah, big time. No, it's great to capitalize on this expertise. I'd encourage our attendees to completely take advantage and link in with our speakers on the panel and indeed our speakers that have been here in person. Folks, that takes us to time, but I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to share your expertise, your thought leadership and your anecdotal experience with us here on the platform today. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right,
Thank you.
excellent stuff. Great to catch up with our esteemed panelists there, James, Harry, Konstantinos, Joe and Akash, for a wonderfully fruitful discussion. I really hope it was helpful there.